Welcome to the second season of Adapt, Climate Change and the Built Environment, where we interview professionals across the private and public sectors to discuss adapting the built environment to a changing climate. We believe that ensuring climate adaptation to extreme weather and evolving climate patterns needs us to re-examine what it takes to make our buildings, infrastructure, and communities resilient and adaptable, so that our society can continue to thrive for years and decades to come. And with that, let's get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm Mónika Serrano, and as usual, I'm here with Jessica Mederson. Hi, Jessica.
Hi, Mónika.
We are so excited today. We're going to talk to Holly Neber. She's the CEO of AEI Consultants and was the leader, or is the leader, of the ASTM Standard Guide for Property Resilience Assessment, which was recently approved just last month through the ASTM consensus-based process. So it will be published and ready for everyone to use anytime soon.
I talk a lot about how much I love standards, but this is the first time I've gotten to see a little bit about the process by which those standards get approved. My understanding is that it is a complicated, complex process. Took a lot of leadership from Holly, but it's definitely worth it.
That's right. I was very lucky to watch it because I was part of the task force that developed this standard guide. We have been working for over 2 years to develop the standard and get consensus from everybody involved and ASTM members. And yes, it's a complex process. It's long, it's cumbersome, but it's definitely worth it because the reputation that ASTM has will guide the implementation of this standard.
And again, as a lawyer, I love standards. So thank you, Mónika, for your part in that too. In addition to the ASTM standard, we also talked to her about what she does then when she's not herding a bunch of cats, which is talking to investors and lenders who are starting to evaluate climate risk. And we talked to her before Hurricane Helene and Hurricane Milton. We've talked about the fact those were such big and tragic hurricanes that may really have an impact going forward, that I feel like we need to benchmark sometimes these conversations that actually took place before those massive tragedies.
That's right. And so we learned that not only investors and lenders are starting to evaluate those climate risks, but also the incorporation of resilience to deal with those climate risks is definitely expected to increase. So very excited to talk to Holly. We have presented with her, so we have had the opportunity to get to know her, to share the knowledge with audiences. And now we are super excited to share her experience and her work, both with her company and the ASTM standard with you all. Let's get to it. Hi, Holly.
Hi, great to be here.
We can't wait to hear more about you and your background and your job. Please tell us about your background and your journey in the built environment, climate resilient space.
All right, great. Well, so my background is in environmental studies, and I kind of think of it as old school environmental now that climate has taken over so much prominence in our lives. But back when I was going through school, environmental studies was really focused on endangered species, ecology, as well as cleaning up environmental impairment caused by contamination by historical activities. So I was naturally drawn to environmental studies because when I was raised, my mom took us to all of the environmental activist marches. We were saving the baby harp seals, saving the whales. We were anti-nukes. We were always doing something to show that we cared about nature. And I personally have such a deep connection to nature. When I went to school, I got an environmental studies degree, and I ended up entering the job market and doing environmental assessments for commercial properties. And at first, I have to admit, I was really bummed that I was doing work for banks and developers in commercial real estate. But then I slowly started to realize how impactful the commercial real estate space is on all of our lives. It really affects everything we do, from where we work to where we go to school to all the things we do outside of our homes. And I gradually became a little bit more enamored with how to work from within that system to make positive change. And then I also came to understand how fascinating the flow of money is through the commercial real estate ecosystem. And that phrase, follow the money, I really started to see that understanding how money flows, how finance flows in commercial real estate does have a huge impact on things like the environment. So I hope I can serve as a bit of an emissary today from the kind of commercial real estate space, that perspective, to the resilience and adaptation community.
I love that idea, right? That not every environmentalist or environmental studies major has to be out planting trees. That is super important. I had an uncle that was like his whole job was planting trees. I'm very glad for it. But the reality is that's not going to be enough if we really want to deal with all of our environmental problems. And so, yes, realizing that we can actually help the money that does drive our economy think of and address these environmental issues is so important. So I think that's awesome. Okay, so with that background, tell us, what are you doing now?
So I am CEO of AEI Consultants, and we do work for all types of commercial real estate interests, from banks to owners to developers. We basically do all the things that someone needs when they're trying to make a decision about investing in or financing a property. And then we also help those people who already own a lot of property to think about how they might manage that property in the most intelligent way. Making money in commercial real estate is all about understanding risk better than your competitors and managing that risk in a way that's an opportunity for you. So what we're really seeing in the climate space is that people are using their climate risk knowledge to make decisions about what assets to hold, which to sell, where to upgrade, and which assets to exit. And so we're helping people make those decisions. And I think all of us in this particular part of the consulting space are looking to help our clients understand what's the asset worth. There's appraisals, there's feasibility studies, there are environmental impairments, engineering weaknesses like this roof needs to be replaced next week, next year. Those kinds of decisions have to be made by people who invest in commercial real estate. And now they're pulling in climate risk as an attribute of those decisions because it absolutely affects property value. So it's been interesting for me in this consulting space to see climate risk, both transition and physical risk, being more and more common in the scopes of work that we're receiving. And I think we've seen this really starting about 5 years ago, but the pace is rapidly picking up today.
When you say like the pace is picking up, I would be curious, is it picking up in certain regions of the country or certain industries? Is there a patterns, or is it just across the board things are picking up?
I think that the pace is picking up because especially public companies are being held more and more accountable for what are they doing on climate risk, whether their investors are overseas or even within the US. Investors want to know that their money is going to be used wisely. So they're asking these investors to demonstrate how they're considering the risks. So that's definitely one driver. And then there's also just the regulatory environment for the lending space. The Federal Reserve, the FDIC, and the OCC, which regulate banks, have all stated that climate risk is financial risk, and they expect it to be managed like any other financial risk. And so I think the banks are taking it slow, but they are moving forward. And I think that shows the trend. It's definitely speeding up in terms of how many people are calling and asking for educational webinars and things on this topic.
And I would even say before those regulatory agencies defined climate risk as financial risk, the TCFD got initiated in the financial world, right? So they have been at least discussing that topic for a little while now.
Yes, it's definitely been out there for a long time, but I think here in the US, a lot of our organizations are a little bit more reluctant to take action, or they're not sure what action to take. But as I think we'll talk more about today, property insurance has really been in crisis the last couple of years, and that has driving a lot of people who previously thought maybe I don't have to worry about this yet, to realize actually this affects me today because I can't get insurance on this property and it's required to get a loan. So I think that piece of the crisis has really created a lot of momentum for people.
Holly, you and I met through the ASTM Property Resilience Assessment, an effort that you have spearheaded. Can you tell us more about it? How did it come about? Who is part of the task group? Where is it at now? How has the process been like?
Yeah, so this has been one of the most rewarding experiences of my career, and meeting you was definitely a highlight of this whole experience. So just in case your listeners don't know, ASTM used to stand for American Society of Testing Materials. It's now known as ASTM International, and ASTM has over 12,000 standards for everything from materials test methods to property assessments, which is in my world, as we discussed. So ASTM really is ubiquitous in the commercial real estate finance space, because when someone's buying something or financing something, they're asking for an ASTM environmental site assessment and possibly a property condition assessment as well. Just like if you're getting a home inspection when you buy a house. One of our clients, a life insurance company who invests in commercial real estate, approached me about chairing this task group for property resilience assessments to focus in on giving people a tool for assessing physical climate change risk for buildings. And we wanted to focus not only on how to identify the hazards and assess the level of risk and vulnerability, but also how to identify resilience measures that could help the property to withstand and recover from those hazards. So my role was really to recruit a diversity of viewpoints to the group through my network. And that has just been so amazing. We started this about 3.5 years ago, and it took only a couple of months. We had over 150 professionals involved in writing different sections of the guide. We have people from engineering, architecture, property insurance, climate science and climate risk modeling, law, finance, construction development, everyone who owns, invests, and manages in real estate, and then a bunch of nonprofits as well who are instrumental in atmospheric research, climate risk, and adaptation. So all these folks came together. We split up into smaller teams and started writing the different sections. And it was just an amazing experience. Now, certainly ASTM, I should say, is a consensus-based standards making organization, and consensus, for anyone who's been involved in developing consensus with that many people, has been challenging. But at the same time, it's just, that's the power of consensus, is that with all the different perspectives, you come up with something that at the end of the day is really strong. So I think we have over 180 professionals involved today. Many of these individuals work with firms who are already performing these types of assessments, or they're on the user side. They're banks, life insurance companies, real estate investment trusts who are ordering these types of assessments. And we know we're not done ever, because first of all, ASTM standards have to be renewed on a periodic basis. But especially in this case, we know that this is a rapidly changing area, and we're going to stay involved as a task group and continue to make updates to the guide. And I would invite any of your listeners who are interested to let me know, because we would love to have their perspectives. And really, if you compare this to the environmental site assessment standard, which was created in the early 90s, that has been updated multiple times, and it still continues to evolve as new contaminants are identified and so on. I expect the ASTM property resilience assessment will also be a multi-decade journey. So it's not too late to get involved if people are interested. And yeah, I would love to connect with anyone who wants to participate.
And I want to give a shout out to you, Holly, because this whole process has not been easy. And you have been obviously instrumental, because you are spearheading the effort on keeping us moving in the right direction and keeping all perspectives in consideration, and making sure that we don't lose members and we still have their perspective. It stays diverse, it stays relevant. So big shout out to you and all that effort.
Thanks, Mónika. I think another thing that's really interesting about the PRA and the adaptation space is that, unlike a lot of other ASTM standards where we're assessing for a particular type of hazard or on a particular type of attribute of a building, the PRA is multi-hazard. So we have flood experts and wind experts and all the different types of expertise that you might need for a multi-hazard assessment. So that has also been really fascinating and fun to be a part of.
I love ASTM standards just as a construction litigator. They're very relevant. As a lawyer, squishy things like means and methods or make sure it's sound or whatever mean nothing, right? If you don't have an objective standard you can point to, words are meaningless. So I love that idea, but I am fascinated by this whole process. And I'm glad Mónika gave you that shout out, because as you were talking about this, I'm like, oh my God, this sounds like this would be a full-time job. For 3.5 years, this had to be so complex. And obviously it's such a new area, right? The adaptation and resiliency space, as Mónika and I talk about, and a lot of our guests talk about, is an area that hasn't gotten enough attention. One question I do have, a lot of times here in the US, US, we can look, to example, to Europe, right? A lot of times Europe is ahead of us on a lot of these climate-related issues. I know it's now ASTM International. So is this really the first kind of property resilience assessment anywhere, or are there other countries or regions that you guys have at least been able to look to for guidance?
We looked at a lot of, when we started our research, we looked at a lot of different options out there, and we found a lot of resources for resilience for communities. And we did have very lively debates about whether you could even assess the resilience of a property, because resilience is systems oriented. But we needed to give commercial real estate decision makers something to focus on so they could look at what's within their control and what are the decisions they can make to invest or divest based on what they learned from the PRA. We didn't find much on property level resilience outside of what we were working on. And we also know, like I said, ASTM is so integrated in commercial real estate finance that we wanted to make sure there was an ASTM standard for this. But I will say that Appendix 1 of the PRA guide is full of resources, and there's so much useful information out there. While resilience and adaptation may be somewhat of a new field in some ways, flood mitigation is ancient, really. There's so much information out there. FEMA has developed so many tools. So it's really important that we acknowledge all of that work that's gone into creating something that could be multi-hazard.
And just one final question, although we could dedicate a whole podcast just to this standard, and maybe we should sometime. But what is the timeline? Has it been rolled out? Is it about to be rolled out? What is the status?
It's about to be rolled out in October of 2024, we are hoping. But I really like to focus on the fact that there are a lot of PRAs already being done. And in fact, if you looked at the HUD, Housing and Urban Development, they have a climate risk assessment scope of work that they require for new building and substantial renovation. It's essentially the PRA. And there are other lending institutions that have already launched a scope of work, which is essentially the PRA. So this is happening.
Yay. And maybe right around the time that your episode is actually airing, because we always record a little bit early, the PRA will be out or about to be out. So that is very cool. Exciting. Congratulations. Yeah. I hope you're going to pop a bottle of champagne or something.
I'm going to have so much champagne.
That's so fantastic. Holly, what happens when commercial real estate is purchased, developed, or financed? Can you tell us about that process and managing risk through it all?
Yeah. So when someone is investing in a property or a bank is financing a property, everyone has one main question, which is, what is this asset worth? And so they'll have usually some sort of an appraisal done. And then they have to understand what are the impairments that might exist. Like I said, does the roof need to be replaced? Is there an underground storage tank that needs to be managed or removed? So they're looking at what is the property worth and how can I make sure it grows in value going forward? With banks, they're particularly concerned with a borrower's ability to repay the loan. And in the case of a default, make sure the property value will hold up and they're not saddled with any big liabilities as the bank. And the banks, of course, also have to follow the lead of the regulatory agencies and make sure they have a risk management plan and they follow it. So that's for commercial real estate lending. Oftentimes they'll have a certain loan size where if it's a loan size over a certain dollar amount, they'll require a certain series of assessments. Or for certain property types, they might say, anytime we're lending on a gas station or waterfront building, we're going to require certain assessments. So the ASTM assessments, the environmental site assessment and property condition assessment, are very common to be referenced in these risk management frameworks that banks have. And so it's really the combination of the regulatory forces and the legal forces. One other item with the environmental site assessment is that it creates an environmental protection against being held responsible for contamination if it's identified after you buy the property. So it's that combination of regulatory forces and legal forces that drive some of the behavior. But at the end of the day, it's really that savvy investor wants to understand the strengths and weaknesses of their asset. And they want to know that they understand what it's worth now and how they can make sure it's worth more in the future.
So you said there's a limit on their liability if there's something discovered after they've purchased the property. Is that only though if they've done all the required studies before, right? You can't use the whole like willful ignorance. We're just going to close our eyes to escape liability.
So the Environmental Protection Agency identified the ASTM Environmental Site Assessment as the way to establish all appropriate inquiry. And if you can establish all appropriate inquiry, then you can become an innocent landowner if something is discovered later. You can't not look and then say it wasn't my fault later. So it's again the power of ASTM standards at scale, because EPA identified the ASTM phase 1 as this way to get this liability protection. It is common in all of these transactions, and it's conducted at scale across the commercial real estate finance, which is billions of dollars a year of real estate that's transacted. And because of that, people really can't buy, sell, or transact without identifying how the environment might be impaired at their site. And if it is impaired, address it and fix it. And so this environmental assessment process has really been responsible for identifying, cleaning up so much contamination, whether from dry cleaners, gas stations, plating facility, all industrial facilities that would never have been discovered otherwise. So again, that's the power of standards, even though it can be a little bit nerdy to be enthusiastic about standards. But thank you, Jessica, for being enthusiastic.
That's awesome. No, that is interesting. And I like that. Yeah, there is a motivation there then to clean things up. It's funny, this isn't climate change related necessarily, but obviously I'm sure PFAS is becoming a big part of this, right? Identifying and cleaning up PFAS. And I actually just saw a new report today about the area around where the atomic bomb was developed, that the radiation there is like near Chernobyl levels still, right? So there's still just, yes, again, aside from climate change, there's still just good old-fashioned environmental problems that we have to deal with as well, that obviously commercial real estate has a big financial incentive to be thinking about.
Yes, and there's also a lot of intersections between old school environmental, like I call it, and climate risk, because you have, let's say, a Superfund site that's had a lot of soil and groundwater cleanup. Maybe they have some above ground tanks. Maybe they have a remediation system in place, and it's in an area that's being impacted by sea level rise or hurricane risk. You run the risk of redistributing more contamination as these conditions change. So there's certainly a lot of interconnection between the two. And as I think about climate risk in our industry as consultants, it's really about making sure all of the assessments we perform and all the future planning we do is climate informed.
That's super interesting. You mentioned banks and lenders asking for certain things. Do you see regional differences? And are there any new questions that you're hearing lately related to climate risk?
We see the large lending institutions being the most proactive on climate risk. The regional banks, the smaller banks, are still a little bit on the sidelines as far as what they want to do, although we are receiving a number of requests for more information. So they're starting to think about, if we decide to look at this, what do you think we'll see and how would we approach it? But the larger banks have really started to look at their overall loan portfolio with the physical risk tools that are available to see if they have a concentration of any particular type of hazard. And banks have done this in the past with things like property type. They might say, we don't want to do any more office loans this year. We're full of office or we're full of retail. They want to have a balanced portfolio. And I think they're starting to have a similar perspective on the hazards associated with climate change and just making sure that they're understanding what their concentration risk. Some of those largest banks are starting to add climate risk elements to their due diligence processes. They're either adding like a checklist or a screen to each loan. So they've done their portfolio and now they're dealing with a deal by deal, loan by loan basis at what is the hazard affecting this property. And then if there is an elevated hazard, they might go to something more like a property resilience assessment. But I would say primarily they're still in the category of screening for risks rather than taking steps. I know of one lender who actually required the borrower to make some adaptation measures, to put some resilience measures in place before they would make the loan. But I think that's a little bit on the outside than of what we're seeing. But for the smaller banks, they have other tools they can use. And one of those tools is to sell off some of their loans to other banks or to entities like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And in fact, research by Professor Jesse Keenan, who I know you both are aware of, he indicated that smaller banks have been shown to preferentially sell loans made in flood-prone areas. The smaller banks might not be doing the deal-by-deal climate risk screening that the larger banks are, but they are still acting on this information in some way.
So obviously the banks are a big driver of a lot of behaviors in our economy, but especially for commercial real estate investors. Are you seeing, is there maybe a little bit of distance between what the banks are looking at versus the commercial real estate investors? And what kind of portfolio evaluations are they making? How far out are they looking? Because of course, anything with climate change, you all always have to talk about near term, midterm, and long term. And yeah, what kind of role is climate playing in their portfolio evaluations?
Yeah, I think actually the real estate investors are ahead of the banks in a lot of ways because the real estate investors have, I don't know, more money, more risk in this game. The lenders only have the risk if the borrower defaults on the loan. The investors actually own this property and I would imagine probably care about the value a bit more. So we saw a lot more activity, a lot of requests from especially the real estate investment trusts because they get a lot of requests for information from their stakeholders. So they start usually at the portfolio level. They run a climate risk screening using one of the commercial risk screening providers to see which sites have the highest risk and then prioritize their next action. It might be integrate this information into our capital plans, for instance. They're also looking at the transition risk considerations. So perhaps you own 100 sites. One of those sites is in Denver. You're not only subject to the physical risks, but you're also subject to the energy performance standard there. And so these investors are making decisions about how much more time will this be a viable property? When should we exit? How much more money should we invest? We have worked with a hotel owner that owns a resort in Key West, and they had that very question. We have enjoyed owning this property for many years, but over the next 5, 10, 15 years, what is the forecast for this site and how much money should we continue to invest in it? I think owners are realizing that it's a competitive advantage to know about the trajectory of hazards into the future. And they're also realizing that this information is becoming more and more commonly looked at, right? So it's like the democratization of climate risk information. It's becoming more common for everyone in the community to see this data, understand the data. So if you're concerned about the long-term value of your site, you're going to be thinking, okay, it might not be an issue today, but in 3 years from now, is the prospective buyer going to be aware of what I'm aware of and perhaps offer me less money because they're concerned about insurance costs or actual hazards to the building?
Wow. Yeah, the thought, I'm sure your hotel in Key West, is not the only commercial real estate down there or in the Keys or along the coast where those conversations are happening. And it is eerie to think about people who live and work in those areas right now, really having no idea that the people who own the commercial real estate around there are saying, this is now a temporary hold, right? We are going to have to draw back. And that's terrifying. And again, why everybody just needs to keep talking about these issues, that people are aware that these conversations are happening right now. And we may not see the results right this second, but they are going to be coming very soon in the next few years.
Yeah, and there is a fear of something called blue lining, which could potentially be where climate risk overlaps with environmental justice and areas historically affected by redlining. So the fear is that banks would increase prices or withdraw services from high-risk areas. Certainly, as you said, businesses could withdraw from certain areas. And I think that could be a really negative outcome of this. Ideally, what we see is access to this knowledge is power, and people are able to make good decisions. but we need to make sure we're sending more adaptation and resilience funding to these communities, not starving them of capital, not starving those communities of jobs and businesses.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I think you alluded to this, but I just want to hone in on this more. Investors often don't hold on to the property for too long. So why should a real estate investor care about the risks 10 years down the road if they know they won't have that property then?
So I think it really is the marketability of the site and understanding, of course, they want it to be worth more in 3 years than it is today. But if their potential buyer pool is looking at this climate risk information and seeing an elevated hazard, they're going to have to answer those questions. So if they feel comfortable with how they're answering that question, maybe they have some resilience measures in place, then for sure go ahead. But I think if they're not sure if the property is resilient to those hazards, then they should be thinking about what's their exit strategy. The other piece of it is property insurance pricing, which is priced annually. And it is notoriously difficult to predict because it is priced annually. And insurance costs affect net operating income. So that affects property value and it affects cash flow for property. So investors really do care about these issues, especially as they're seeing the insurance markets adapt.
So one of the things you've talked about, obviously, with both the banks and the commercial real estate investors is analyzing these climate risks. Of course, to do that, you need climate models, right? And as Doug Parsons and America Adapts has talked about on their great podcast episode, climate modeling, or what is it, the Wild West, I think, of climate modeling. It's tough because it's not like there's, okay, here's one nice, neat, tiny climate model. We all agree this is what's going to happen, let's say in New Jersey over the next 10 years, in Wisconsin over the next 10 years. So how do you and your clients figure out what is a reliable source, or how do we analyze what the climate risks are in a particular area?
That is such a fascinating question. It would be great if there was a single source for that information. And I have heard Doug's episodes on this, and I think it's fascinating. For us that are using this information to help our clients, I heard this quote while we were generating the PRA guide, and one of our task group members said the quote, "All models are wrong, some are useful." And that has really stuck with me because I think we can use these models to give some idea of directionality of change predicted by the models, and then weigh that with the type of decision that's being made. Are you building a waterfront tower in Boston, or are you building a garden style apartment building in Southern California? These are different types of properties, different investments. And so the level of certainty you can tolerate is a little different. But all these decisions require acknowledgement of the uncertainty. We try to help people make no regrets moves, make informed decisions. And actually the PRA guide, the whole section on stage one, the PRA is 3 stages. Stage 1 is screening for the hazards. Stage 2 is visiting the site to understand the vulnerability of the building to those hazards. And then stage 3 is implementing resilience measures, identifying resilience measures if needed. But that stage 1 section of the PRA guide talks a lot about some basic agreements that the climate modeling companies have made regarding disclosures, so that we as an industry can have a certain set of expectations about what they will tell us and how we will be able to understand the level of uncertainty associated with the findings. But I think it's very tempting for people in commercial real estate to want to plug in an expected damage or loss number and have some certainty around that. It's just what commercial real estate people do is, okay, I know it's worth $1 million. I know my environmental impairment's 50,000. I want to know, what's my climate risk number? They want a number, and unfortunately, I just don't think it's that clean. It's a messy process. And so we really need to take this information as a signal, but not a final word.
Oh, that's a great summary. We'll put the link to America Adapts podcast on the notes. And thank you for going through the steps of ASTM PRA. I run into differences between different climate models all the time and suffer from the same. But we deal with a lot of situations that have uncertainty around it. So I think we can get around this one as well.
Yes.
And we'll use it for just more informative purposes. You mentioned in your introduction, you were involved in environmental efforts growing up, and you eventually found real estate sexy. And not only that, but you found that you could have impact, right? Can you share with us, how do you see climate risk evaluation in the real estate sector powerful at scale?
So when we help a client understand what's going on at a property, what's the life story of that property? Was it a gas station? Was it a dry cleaners? What other impairments might be there? Does it need a new roof? Does it need a new elevator? All of those questions drive action. Either the seller is motivated to deal with that issue before they sell it, or the buyer understands, okay, I need to budget for that and take action after I buy it. So that information is power, and they're able to drive good action to preserve this asset. I think we're going to see the same thing with climate risk, where there is greater awareness of what the climate hazards are that will affect a building. And as a result, there will be changes made at the building itself that will help the building retain its value. Ideally, in an ideal world, Mónika, I'm expecting the insurers to help carry some of these costs, because they're going to give cheaper insurance when there are resilience measures. And I know I mention you because you're part of NIBS, and the National Institute of Building Sciences has done a lot of research about this, but we really need a confluence of many different forces coming together to help our buildings become more resilient. And so that will be the consultants like us giving information about what the climate risks are at the time someone's buying or financing or developing. And then the insurers hopefully giving a break on the pricing, because they know that the building will be more resilient. And then the banks giving better interest rates because they know this building is more resilient, right? So if we could have all these forces come together, combined with the fact that this information is now more readily available during these key decision points during the life cycle of real estate, I think it could be very powerful.
Holly, I love this. Obviously, for me in particular, as a construction litigator, I think maybe for Mónika too, we come along a little bit later in the process of the built environment, right? We come in when Mónika comes in before me, when a developer wants to build something new. I come in as soon as there's a problem, which sometimes can be very early in the process. Sometimes it's years later. But I really do love having this. You talk about like how these issues are thought about upfront, and the role that really commercial real estate and risk management, always one of my favorite topics, can play in helping improve basically the resiliency in our built environment, get people thinking about it more. And of course, your work with the ASTM standard is just incredible. And again, that's worthy of a whole standalone episode, because I can't imagine that. But we've covered a lot. Is there anything else, any other shout outs you want to give to the commercial real estate processes or the ASTM standard, or other things that you're seeing that you think can help us improve resiliency in the face of climate change?
I think risk management is really important, as you mentioned, and the same way that maybe climate risk and resilience is somewhat new in the broader scheme of things, but flood mitigation is very old. In the same way, risk management is something we have been doing for generations. So I think that originally, as climate risk and sustainability started to emerge into the commercial real estate risk management space, many people in my sector felt like, though, that's sustainability, that's climate risk, that's over there. Risk management is over here. And even today, many organizations that have a climate risk or sustainability silo and then a risk management silo that's separate. And I think what is really exciting about the time we live in today, although the reason for the crisis is not a happy one, but that it's giving risk management an opportunity to really contribute on this important topic. And when risk identifies something that can be mitigated, then we can all win by helping that building, in this case, in a building's case, be more resilient. And that preserves the value, and that helps the investors. So one thing I try to do is invite people, if their background is risk management, don't feel like, oh, sustainability adaptation is something that happens over there. This is part of your world today. I also would invite people that see themselves more on the climate risk sustainability side to really reach across to the risk management people and say, let's connect the dots within our organization and try to help. Because we do have this opportunity to share information and help everyone make better decisions and ultimately help our buildings and therefore our communities be more resilient. And lastly, I'd say all of us that are in the consulting space need to be upskilling our teams to ensure they understand how climate risk is affecting the jobs they do. Having informed decision makers will have a positive impact on all of us. I know here at AEI, we're constantly training our staff on how to utilize these tools, what the uncertainties are. And I know all of the other firms in our space are also thinking about this. So it's something that we're all doing, and I hope we can all continue to move forward together.
That is a lovely sentiment. Thank you. And yes, again, I love getting shout outs to risk managers, even though if they do their job well, they put me out of a job, but that's okay. I want them to do well. And yeah, resilient buildings help keep communities and people and businesses resilient. So it is a win for all of us.
Holly, I want to give a shout out to, I don't know if you guys are familiar with GARP, the Global Association of Risk Professionals. They have one certification that it's a couple of years old called SCR, Sustainability and Climate Risk. I took the test this past spring, and it's not an easy test. Studying the process was very informative. There were some sections that I was very familiar with. There were some other sections that I was not. So I think it's a good certification to bring in risk professionals, climate professionals, and just get to know the other sector more and then continue to collaborate.
I love the GARP podcast and America Adapts, and now yours, of course. So I never have a dull moment when I'm going for a walk.
I agree. Those are two of the podcasts that I regularly listen to. So we'll make sure we put a link to the podcast and a link to the certification.
Thank you so much for all of this, Holly. As always, both thank you for all your time on the ASTM PRA standard, for all the work you're doing. And I hope your mom is proud of you continuing to fight for the environment. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. Thanks for listening to Adapt: Climate Change and the Built Environment. We hope you enjoyed this episode and come back to hear more of our conversations with people leading the way and addressing the issues facing the built environment as our climate changes. Please rate, review, and subscribe, and share our podcast with others who may be interested. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for topics or guests for future seasons, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at adaptthebuiltenvironment@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.